Today's topic is creativity is the heart of play. Creativity is the intelligence having fun, and it plays into the innate human desire to improve upon life. What's so beautiful about play is that a person is imaginative, they're open, they're curious, and they have high energy and alertness, and all these qualities help us to be creative because we're in the present moment. We aren't acting from the past. So often, they say that adults can become psychological antiques. They do something once, and then every time that the situation comes by, maybe a completely different situation, they act with the same response that's acted in the past. There's a fun story written by Stuart Brown in his book Play. And he tells of a field biologist who was training his river otters to swim through a hoop. And if the river otters successfully swam through the hoop, they got a reward. And every time they swam through the hoop, they would look up expectantly and to see if they'd get their fish. Well, they got their fish after going through the hoop several times. And then the river otters wanted to know more about how the world worked. So they would swim backwards through the hoop, and they'd look up and say, did it work this time, even though we swam backwards through the hoop? And then other times they would swim up to the hoop and then turn around and swim back the other way. And they'd look up expectantly to see if they would get a reward or not. And they just kept trying different variations. You could kind of imagine if it was a bunch of humans swimming and being trained by who knows who through the hoop, and they do it once and they get their fish, and then somebody else does it in a different way that's not conventional. And you can imagine all the other humans saying, "You're blowing it, it's not gonna work, get it together, do it like the rest of us." But the river otters, they have a very playful nature, and they just tried all these variations because they wanted to see how their world worked. Well, Einstein, he said the difference between himself and everybody else is if there was a needle that was hidden in the haystack, once a person found a needle in the haystack, he would stop. But Einstein said he'd go through the whole haystack looking to see how many different needles there were. And this is what's so important. We just find out different ways of doing things. And what's so important with play is that it's all creative, because we aren't acting from the past, we aren't acting from the future. And play helps us to try new roles in life, new ideas and thoughts, and we sort of suspend the normal for something much more. There's a principle that whenever you take two unrelated subjects and put them together, the mind wants to associate them and find their commonality and find bridges of commonality between the two objects. There's whenever we touch nature deeply, an aspect of nature, we get into a new reality, its own reality, and its own way that it lives its life. And it's different from our lives. And there's a cross-pollination between that object than ourselves. And it just enriches and expands our world. That's why I think experiential education, it's so important in so many ways. Of course, it helps to activate all the different parts of ourselves because we're relating to the subject in different ways, not just with the intellect. But also, what it does is we get to understand new things and the way things are. And Ralph Waldo Emerson said that every natural fact is inspired by a spiritual reality. It's just a reflection of this principle. And so we just learn much more in life. There's a Russian psychologist wrote in the early part of last century. And he studied two Russian girls. One was 7 years old and another was 5 years old. And he said that most children, they do things unconsciously. They just do things. And sometimes you kind of wonder, and you ask a child, why did you do that? And they don't really know why they did that. But they treated each other like all siblings would. Sometimes they ignored each other. Sometimes they played together. And sometimes they fought with each other. And just as any siblings would do. But one day, they decided that they were going to play at being sisters. And so they both started to dress alike. You have to imagine another sister right next to me. So they dressed similar. They started talking the same way, and they started walking the same way. And they started to treat each other as their idealized conception of what another sister would be, or the way that sisters would treat each other. And it was a much more inspired way of being together than they had been before. And that's because play is intentional. And they were putting more effort into their play. And it wasn't the fact that they were biological sisters that drew them closer together. It was the fact that they were playing at sisters that helped them to develop a more exalted experience of being sisters. Now, how does that relate to nature education? Well, all the activities, sharing nature activities, but other activities that people create, are to help us to see and feel nature in a new way. As an example, we have this activity that we use with great success. It's called the guided tree imagery. And in this activity, people become a tree. And a tree, as you know, influences the micro weather and makes a place that's more conducive for other forms of life to exist. And a tree provides food and shelter for the myriad of other forest creatures and plants. And people, after playing the tree and going through the life cycle of the tree, they have much more of an intentional relationship with everything in the forest. And people say that they just feel this great harmony for everything around them. And it's because they've taken on the role intentionally of being a tree. And they've developed a brother and sisterhood with all the creatures around them. And it's because it was an intentional experience. You know, how many times have we passed through the forest? We might admire the trees, I'm sure we do, and we look for different things in the forest. But to create that whole experience of having a real tangible sense of being one with the forest and a strong sense of kinship with everything, well, that's on another high level. And we might experience that at times, but this is something that you can consciously promote with people through these kinds of experiences in an intentional way. And so the idea that when we play at something, we're playing at our best, and we have more of ourself invested in the exercise, and we're doing it with our whole being. And we aren't doing it unconsciously, just kind of passing through life, or maybe learning information about the trees and interrelationships. That's very helpful to understand on an intellectual level. But when we can understand it on the level of our whole being, it's very, very dynamic experience. I'd like to tell you some of the things that people have said after the experience. They said that they felt that they had a great feeling of expansion that and love that included everything around them. They felt a sense of serenity in themselves. They felt a feeling of being a great nurturer to everything around them. All these different things they've mentioned. I once asked a group of people to say 3 things about the forest without doing this experience. And the words that people came up with were brown, bark, green. And they were just sort of matter-of-fact words. And they didn't have the emotional connection that these other people that had done the guided tree exercise had. And that's because they entered into the life of the tree, and they went through the seasons of the year as the tree, and they were sheltering everything in the forest, and birds are landing on their branches, and they created a sense of warmth during the winter and coolness during the summer months. And there was this tremendous and beautiful interaction between them and all the other forest life. And they became bigger than they were before because their mindset or their feeling included everything in the forest. And so, what do we really want to accomplish when we lead other people in nature and we want to share nature in some way? Often it could be something specific about different trees or birds or plants or maybe the different kinds of rocks. But behind that instruction, that sharing of information, what we hope that knowing that information will help a person to have a greater love for the environment. Well, there are different ways that you can work in a very direct way that can really help open the heart and actually help us to feel a greater sense of our being as a part of nature. I have a friend who teaches in the American Southwest, and he had young elementary school students. He had American children in his class, and then he also had some Navajo children. And he asked the American children to draw a picture of themselves. And so on a large piece of paper, they drew their legs, they drew their trunk of their spine and their arms and the head, and they covered on that big piece of paper a big picture of themselves, as they were asked to do by their teacher. Well, the Navajo children, they drew themselves differently because on this big piece of paper, they drew themselves very small. They drew the canyon walls, and they drew the sandy wash and the clouds in the sky and a few plants, because they felt everything around them was just as much a part of who they were as their own arms and legs. And they had a much greater sense that everything around them was truly a part of who they were. And isn't that our goal in nature education, if we're an educator, outdoor leader, or if we're a parent? There's a definition for maturity written by J. Donald Walters in his book, Education for Life. He said that maturity is the ability to relate to other realities and not only to one's own. And isn't this what we're trying to do in nature? Nature fascinates children. There's just so many wonderful things to see and discover. And as we get older, we understand about the relationships and how the different animals and plants adapt to their environment and relate to each other. And we start to see how it's all tied together. When we can connect that and we can help people to feel that, their experience is going to be a lot more profound. Tanaka Shoso, the first pioneering conservationist in Japan, he said that the care of rivers is not a question of rivers, but of the human heart. Studies have shown that young children, they're divergent. That means that they think outside the box. About 98% of the children are that way, and only 2% of adults are that way. There's a story, a true story, of a child whose frog fell down into cinder blocks that were for a foundation for a home. And they were still open. The cinder blocks are cement with a round hole, and they stack them on each other. And then they pour concrete through. Well, the concrete hadn't been poured. And 5 feet down, the little boy, he saw his frog trapped there, and he didn't have anything long enough to grab his frog. Well, they saw the boy pour water into the cinder blocks, and as the water rose, the frog rose to the top and it was able to hop out. Well, they tried this experiment, being sort of fascinated by what the little 5-year-old boy did with a group of adults and a group of 7-year-olds, and then with 5-year-olds. Well, they found actually that the 5-year-olds, they found a way to get the frog out, a lot of them, by pouring water into the cinder blocks and getting the frog out. Well, only 7 or 10% of the 7-year-olds, they thought creatively and they could get the frog out. Well, only 2% of the adults thought that you could get the frog out. And they just kind of looked at the problem, and then they just shook their head and just probably said, "Poor frog," and left the premises. And children just naturally they're just very inventive, they're very courageous, and they don't know the word no, you can't do this. They're ready to just dive in and jump in. But adults, unfortunately, we've had more life experience, and sometimes we're more hesitant to do things. Often if we have a past experience in life and it works real well, then we'll keep using that strategy over and over again, even in new situations where it doesn't apply as much. And then also, it's the way our brains are made. We develop these neural connections, and in the frontal cortex of the brain, we categorize things. And so this is a chair, this is a table, that's a bird. And when we see something for the first time, it's novel enough. There's billions of sensations that keep coming to us all the time, and we can't pay attention to all of them. We develop the sense of habit, where we do things automatically so they don't require a lot of our information. And so we'll go by and we see something, and if we've seen it before, we see it secondhand. We go, oh, that's such and such, and we have our memory of what we've seen in the past, but we don't see it anew. And so that kills our sense of wonder because we're looking through several filters. There was a woman in her book, Original Vision. She's a neuroscientist called D. Joy Coulter. And she told a very intriguing story when a young Tibetan monk visited a symposium on the brain. They were talking about how children, they experience things with pure sensation. And that's why they have a sense of wonder, and they could be mesmerized by a butterfly or a field of flowers, and they can just be entranced. A friend of mine who founded the Living Wisdom Schools, Michael Duranja, he calls it a spiritual experience where children, they just become so fascinated and they just stare at something and they just are taking it all in. But this is something that traditionally starts to fade away at age 5 or 6 years old. But this monk from Tibet, he was talking about how it doesn't have to be. During the symposium, he stopped and he looked over at an imaginary flower and he said, flower. First time. And then the discussion came on. Other people were talking and the discussion moved on. And then a little bit later, the young Tibetan monk said again, flower. First time. And he saw it completely fresh. He didn't see it as something, as a category, as a name that he had seen before. And he had that complete awareness of that flower at that moment in time. Somebody said that when we're in the present moment, we have God. We have perfect nature awareness because everything is alive and very intense and our senses are heightened. Everything is living. Young children think that everything's alive, and that's because they are experiencing it as alive. They aren't experiencing it secondhand. You can imagine the possibilities if we're walking through life and everything is alive and we really can feel the spirit of everything that we come in contact with, how much more rich our lives are and how much more we learn. And in terms of creativity, the more you feel a part of something, the more your world expands and has a greater sense of dimension. And it's in that richness, there's all kinds of new possibilities. Well, we've created this game called a camera in order to help people to have that experience of more pure seeing. Sort of like the Tibetan monk, at least to give us a little experience of it. Again, this game is called Camera Game. It's a sharing nature game. And it's done with 2 people. One person is the human camera, and the second person is the photographer. Well, the human camera closes his or her eyes, and then when a picture is taken, the photographer taps the shoulder twice, and the lens of the eyes open, and they just hold them for about 3 seconds, and then they tap again, and the eyes close. If you do a panning shot, you can hold the eyes open longer, and you could hit the shoulder, and they could look out across a vast prairie. Or maybe they could look at the base of a tree, up to its spreading branches into the sky, and then close again. And because the lens is only open for maybe 3 seconds or a little bit longer in a panning shot, what happens is the person does not start to daydream and drift in and out. There was a study by 2 Harvard scientists that said that only 47% of the time, even if we're doing activity that we like, or we concentrate on the activity the rest of the time, our mind is restless and scattered. It's thinking of other things. We have just, hundreds and hundreds of thoughts that are flowing through our mind every minute. They even did a study of Canadians and how long their attention span was. In the year 2000, it was a Microsoft study, they found that Canadians, they had an attention span of 13 seconds. And then they studied the Canadians again in their study, and they found in the year 2013, I think it was, might have been 2012, the Canadians' attention span had slipped to 8 seconds. So it was 33% decline in their attention span. Well, they also studied the attention span of goldfish. And goldfish had an attention span of 9 seconds in the year 2000. And then the goldfish, I don't think they change as much. Their technology has stayed pretty much the same. But when they studied their attention span again in the year 2012, it was still 9 seconds. So if you were to put the Canadians and the goldfish head to head in terms of who had the longest attention span, the goldfish would win with 9 seconds, and your average Canadian would lose because their attention span was 8 seconds. And so if you ever are talking to a Canadian, make sure that you have their attention so that they hear what you have to say. Of course, I'm from the United States, and I've fondly traveled in Canada many, many times, and the simplicity of life there, and just the human values that the Canadians have, and the sense of simplicity. You know that the attention span is much more likely to be less in the United States than Canada. But so this is what we're up against when we're trying to have an experience of nature, is that we are just distracted so much, and we can't really see things. But this is what's so beautiful about deep nature play. There's a quality of getting us into the present moment, and so we aren't relying on past experience or anticipation of the future. We're just wholly where we are, and in that experience, our senses are heightened. Everything is more alive and fresh, and we aren't acting in a pre-conventional way about what something is. We are looking at something how it actually is, rather than as a memory of the past or something that we've categorized. There's a gentleman that does a lot of corporate training, and he has shared this experiment with a lot of adult groups, executives, business people. And he holds up a piece of paper, and he asks the people to tell him what they see. And almost invariably, about 100% of the adults say, "I see a black dot." Or "I see a dot" is actually what he said. And then he says, "Is there anything else you see?" And they say, "Well, we see a black dot." And that's pretty much what adults say. But he says he's done it with children at different times, younger children. And when he asks them, "What do you see?" they might say, "A black moon in a white sky," or "a top of a telephone pole," or "a squished bug without any legs." And they have all different kinds of answers, just because their minds are fresh. Our brain is already personalized, and so we, to save time, we just come up with an answer, and we say that's what it is. But children, they haven't made all these neural connections yet, and so everything is new and fresh for them. And so they have all kinds of answers, and that's why they can play with something. A broomstick can be something that witch would use to fly all over the sky, and they're just living in the experience, and it's alive for them. you know, we all need to grow up and develop the adult skills to function in life. But if we take the magic out of life and that sense of wonder, we take out the joy of life. And you know, everyone who's inventive, they don't work in the normal way. You know, the small-minded scientist works conventionally. He studies the pieces of nature and comes up with a kind of little bit of discovery. I once had an amusing story. It wasn't really amusing, but an interesting experience when I was in university. And my major was nature awareness. It was a self-created major, and I wanted to learn. I took science classes and other classes that gave me more of an intuitive experience of life. And one of my classes was mammalogy. And I was taught by a very kind professor about ready to retire. And we went on our first field trip. And I had, although my dad was a meat cutter, I had become a vegetarian about 2 or 3 years previously. I was in my, I think I was 20 years old at the time. And we were there, and it was near Mount Lassen National Park, and we didn't quite know what we were going to do. And the professor started handing out shotguns to all of us. And our job was to go out into the forest and shoot every chipmunk and squirrel we could see so we could skin it, and then, you know, look at the bone sizes and tell the different species from one another. And I remember looking at another friend who I liked. I didn't know that well, but I liked him. And I think he was a vegetarian, or at least he didn't want to shoot any chipmunks, because we kind of looked at each other like, this is really archaic. And so we went out in the forest. We shot our guns off a few times in this open sky, and then came back and said we didn't have any luck. Well, this is the old way of studying more the details of nature and not really tying it in and really finding the life of nature. And the beauty of play is that, and I keep saying this over and over again, is that it's immersive. And we aren't thinking of ourselves anymore. That's also what's exciting about play, is that we can try out new roles, of ways of being, and new ideas, and we sort of suspend our old patterns of life, and we enter into a new way of being. And so we can just, in a safe way, we can try out new things, and then we can follow them if there seems to be merit in them. And so children, they have that ability. But you know, a great scientist, an artist, a writer, they play too. Their play, adult play, is just a different kind of play than a child that's building a sandcastle. But it's still play. They're playing in their laboratory. And so many of the Nobel Prize winning scientists or writers, they said they've gotten inside their subject through visualization, imagination, empathy. And there was one scientist, Barbara McClicklock. She would, in her microscope, she would look in the corn genes. She was studying them. And she would just like enter into them, and they became her friends. And she could just see the big chromosomes, and she entered into those chromosomes. And she made all kinds of discoveries that the other scientists weren't making because she had entered wholly into it. One fellow that was writing about all these great scientists and artists, the ones that really broke new ground and made original contribution in their field, he said they had ways of becoming one with something other, so that they really understood it and saw it in a way that wasn't conventional. And Barbara McClicklock, she just revolutionized her whole field of study just because of the way that she was working. We all know that corporations, businesses, they value creativity because the competition is so great, and somebody creates a product and then people copy that product, and they have to be innovative. They have to come up with something new all the time. And so it's a very high priority to be creative. Well, if you can imagine raising a child who is naturally curious and open, imaginative, filled with the joy of life, and has the courage to experiment and try on different ways. If you can imagine nurturing that child through the school years, remember, I said, and it's only because studies have said, but also my personal observation, is that around age 5 or 6, children are starting to lose their joy of learning because they're learning in a more mechanistic way. They're learning about information they don't see the purpose for. It's not a living way of learning in many cases. And so they just kind of close themselves off. Michael Duranja, who I mentioned, founded the Living Wisdom Schools. He once went into a classroom of 5 and 6-year-olds, and he just saw their joy in life. And it was very exciting just to see, as we all feel when young children, they have that innocence and that tremendous enthusiasm and wonder for everything they experience. But then he went into a class of maybe 15, 16-year-olds, and they were just kind of sitting there slumped. And the teacher was talking, giving information. Some students were listening, but so many others had closed down. You know, you can physically force children to be in a class, but you can't mentally enforce that. The only way you can mentally enforce that is to make learning captivating, exciting, where there's a sense of self-discovery and they see the importance of it. And the lack of play, we think play is good for young children, but play is important to keep alive all the way through our lives. And so if you can help young children to have that natural openness, that sense of discovery, the high energy, the courage to see things in a new way, and if you can just nurture that all the way through school, then there'll be adults that have that characteristic, have that courage, that openness to experiment in different ways, and they'll make original contribution to life. Einstein said that the world advances through intuition. He used logic as a secondary step in order to understand things, but first came the inspiration. Well, we all have to work in a different way, and according to our educational setting, or maybe setting at home, and that. But the more that we can bring that sense of play in, because what we're doing is we're bringing a sense of openness, a sense of wanting to discover, not to settle with the way things are. What's very, very interesting is the creative person, they shape their world. A person who's not creative, they're shapen by the world. And a creative person, it's that human instinct to improve the world. And if we can keep that alive with people, we'll have all these people. I don't know how many people live on the planet. I know in China there's 1.4 billion people. But if you just go across the whole world, and if you're having people that have that sense of confidence to really change the world, change their situation in their little area, the world would be a much more incredible place. And it'd be a place of being connected to so many things, to different aspects of nature, to all of life, to other people. And we understand that we've met older people who have kept that very much alive in their lives. And we can use deep nature play and the activities and other kinds of play to support that. There's a Chinese mother who attended our workshop, and she had a hard time relating to her young child because her child wanted to play all the time. And this woman was a businesswoman. You know, adults, they see a child play and they want them to hurry up and stop playing and get serious and start learning the tools of life. But the children, they're taking in so much more information, they're developing their brain, all these kinds of things. But once she started playing herself, she could feel the exhilaration, the thrill, and the discovery. And then she could appreciate that aspect in her own child, and she could help nurture that child so that, you know, there's development stages, and if a child misses an aspect of that stage, then they miss out of that their whole lives. And so each stage of life needs to be honored and nurtured. Well, she was able to support her child in that way so that that child could grow up with these qualities still a part of herself and have confidence and not have these qualities shut down in herself just because her mother started to understand the value of play. Well, I hope that institutions and society will support play more and more because it's so important. I know that it's become a popular topic now, and a lot of people are encouraging it, but it hasn't really grabbed hold of the educational system yet, and a lot of other places, because people are still adults thinking that play isn't that important. It's something that children outgrow. But those children that retain their sense of curiosity, their sense of openness, their sense of wonder, experimentation, and the high energies, they're the ones that are going to make original contributions in this world. And they'll be happier individuals as well. Thank you for joining us today. If you would like to learn more about deep nature play, you can go to our website, sharingnature.com.